Hello everyone, good day. So we are now on lesson number 3 in Assessment and Learning 1, Purposes and Form of Classroom Assessment. So for today, we'll be talking about the three purposes of assessment. One is assessment for learning. It's usually done before and during instruction. The second is assessment of learning. It's done after instruction. And assessment as learning. It's happening at any point in the instructional process. By the way, I got these slides from Dr. Marilyn Balagtas of Philippine Normal University. So let's try to talk about the details on the three purposes of assessment. We have assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. For assessment for learning, we have three forms. One is placement assessment. Second is formative assessment, and the third is diagnostic assessment. Let's talk about the three in detail. Placement assessment is done prior to the instruction. Its main purpose is to assess the needs of the learners to have basis in planning for a relevant instruction. And teachers use this assessment to know what their students are bringing into the learning situation and to use this as starting point for instruction. The results of this assessment place students in specific learning groups to facilitate the teaching and learning process. When you are in grade 1, I know you were able to encounter placement assessment wherein you were asked to read and you are asked to write so that you can be placed in sections where you have the same ability. So all those who can read in one section, all who cannot read that well in one section, so that the intervention will be done on similar groups. Second, we have formative assessment. It's done during instruction. It it is this assessment where teachers continuously monitor the students' level of attainment of learning objectives. So it's more on monitoring students' progress. The results of this assessment are communicated clearly and promptly to students for them to know their strengths and weaknesses and the progress of their learning. So this is very direct feedbacking. This assessment could be written or through observations of ongoing interactions between the teacher and the students or between and among the students themselves. This is a non-grade assessment as the intention is to make teaching more effective to produce quality learning. So formative assessment is more on feedbacking and it's non-graded. Usually in depth ed, it is recorded but not part of the grade. It is just to know the student's progress. The third is diagnostic, which is done during instruction also. This is used to determine students' recurring or persistent difficulties in the lesson learned. So it's more on the difficulties of the learners. It searches for underlying causes of students' learning problems that do not respond to first aid treatment. So it's more on underlying causes. It helps formulate a plan for detailed remedial instruction. So after knowing what are the problems of the students, you can make already a remedial instruction plan. And this is also non-graded as the intention is to make teaching more effective and relevant in addressing the difficulties of the students in understanding the lesson. I know there are times that you will be confused which of placement, formative, and diagnostic is the correct answer. But later on our sample let type questions, you will understand why this one is the answer and why the other one is not the answer. Next is assessment of learning. So for this purpose of assessment, it's usually done after the instruction and One form is the summative assessment. Its purpose is to certify what students know and can do and the level of their proficiency or competency. So it's more on giving a grade. Its results reveal whether or not instructions have successfully achieved the curriculum outcomes. The information from assessment of learning is usually expressed as marks or letter grades, the results of which are communicated to the students, parents, and other stakeholders for decision making. It is also a powerful factor that could pave the way for educational reforms. So, in assessment of learning, it's usually more on giving a grade so that the parents and the principal and other stakeholders, also scholarship persons, can can know what the student understood or what are the things that the student know and can do. If we will differentiate assessment for learning and assessment of learning, assessment for learning is more on making the students learn. So it's really purpose on doing that assessment is to look into the learner's progress and let them learn. For assessment of learning, this is more on this is more on giving a grade. So it's just measuring what the students know. So example, if you're giving a test and what you did is just give a test and record it and you did nothing about it, it's assessment of learning because you just get the summative results. But if you give a test and after giving that test, you check again students' understanding and then you let them go back with that concepts for them to learn. It's assessment for learning because the purpose is for them to learn. For assessment of learning, the purpose is to give a grade. And we also have assessment as learning. It happens, you can have it before, during, or after the learning process. So it happens at any time in instructional process. Because assessment as learning for students, its purpose is for the students to become responsible in planning, strategizing, monitoring, and assessing the progress of their own learning. So it's more on reflecting their own learning. For teachers, the purpose of this assessment enables them to understand and perform well their role of assessing for and of learning. It requires teachers to undergo training on how to assess learning and be equipped with the competencies needed in performing student assessment. So, in assessment as learning for teachers, it's more on uh, getting feedback on how they taught the different subjects for them to reteach if there is a need, or to change strategies for that the students will learn more. It's more on looking into uh, it's more on looking into how well they were able to deliver the lessons to the students. If there is a need to revise the lessons, then they need to revise. So it depends on the results, on their reflection also, on how they see their teaching process. By the way, in assessment as learning, there are two terms that you need to know. One is self-assessment. It's the one of the form of assessment as learning. Self-assessment is more on one's awareness of what he can do and what he also know. While the other one is metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So you are going beyond thinking. Let's try some left type questions for us to clearly understand the different terms and concepts that we have here. This one. Which of these assessments will you likely do when you're assessing for learning? Take note, if you're assessing for learning, that's formative. diagnostic, and placement. So which of these are you going to do? It's letter D, assessing the strengths and weaknesses of students for feedbacking. Take note, if you have feedbacking, that's formative. Therefore, assessing for learning is assessing the strengths and weaknesses of students for feedbacking. Giving grades, reporting to parents, and recommending new policies is assessment of learning. It is summative in nature. If the teacher favors assessment for learning, which will she do most likely? Take note. Assessment for learning. Formative, diagnostic, placement. So which of these? It's letter C because of the word feedback. Give specific feedback to the students. Mrs. Katid uses evidences of student learning to make judgments on student achievement against goals and standards. She does this at the end of the unit or period. Which purpose does the assessment serve? Take note. Mrs. Katid uses evidences of student learning to make judgment. So there is a judgment to know the student's achievement. And it's done at the end of the unit or period. It is assessment of learning. It is summative in nature. The purpose of the teacher is to give a grade. So that's assessment of learning, summative. Teacher Jarek is planning to do an assessment of learning. Take note of, summative. Which of these should he include in his plan considering his purpose of assessment? So his assessment is assessment of learning. Of is summative. So which of these? It's letter B. How to certify students' achievement. So if you have a summative assessment or assessment of learning, you are more on giving a grade or certifying students' achievement. Designing one's instruction is part of the assessment for learning, and it is more on placement assessment. How to determine the area of interest of the learners, and how to give immediate feedback to students' strengths and weaknesses. Those are assessment for learning. Usually letter D is on the formative assessment. Okay, how about this one? Through observation techniques, a mathematics teacher learned that students are non-participative during interactive lecturing. Consequently, the teacher adopted collaborative learning. What form of assessment prompted him to do so? Take note, the teacher made use of interactive lecturing, but the students are non-participative. So the teacher used another strategy, which is collaborative learning. Which assessment prompted the teacher to do so? It is formative assessment because as the student look into the process on how students are learning and they are not participative, therefore there's a need to change of strategy. So that's what the teacher do. So the teacher made use of formative assessment. So during the instruction, the teacher changed strategies for the students to learn because the purpose of formative assessment is really to monitor students' learning and for them to learn. Next, this one. Mr. Castro conducted a short test after discussing matter to get feedback on how well the students learn. The results may not be used for grading purposes. This is called as, okay. So Mr. Castro conducted a short test after discussing matter, but it will not be recorded. The purpose is just to get feedback on how the students learn. Take note that it is non-graded. So which of this? Giving a short test after discussing matter, it is formative assessment. It's more on giving feedback. So if you say feedback, that is formative. At the beginning of the school year, the 6-year-old learners were tested to find out who among them can already read. The result was used to determine their sections. What form assessment is given to them? Take note. At the beginning of the school year, the 6-year-old learners were tested. So I think these are the ones who are going to be in grade 1. The result was used to determine their sections. So if you have sectioning, it is more on placement assessment. So if you will place them in their sections, respective sections that is on placement. Take note, that's placement section. Who among the teachers below performed diagnostic assessment? Take note, diagnostic assessment is more on knowing the systematic errors, the difficulties of the learners for remedial instruction. Which of those? Okay, the correct answer is letter C. Miss Suan, who gave a 10-item test to find out the specific lesson which students failed to understand. So in letter C, you can see student difficulties. I think others answer letter D. Mrs. Lopez, who administered a readiness test to incoming grade 1 pupils. This one is placement assessment because if you are giving a readiness test to incoming grade 1, they are not yet your students. They will be coming into your grade 1 class. So you look into the readiness test. That will be placement assessment. So if they can read, then they will be in this section. If they cannot, to another section, something like that. Letter D is on placement assessment. It's not diagnostic assessment. So letter C is the correct answer. Okay, so let's summarize. Assessment for learning is done for, that's formative, placement, and diagnostic. It will be done before and during instruction. And we have assessment of learning, the summative assessment. It's done after instruction. And we have assessment as learning in between. It could happen at any point of the instructional process. So you can have metacognition and self-assessment. So as a summary, we can put it in a chart, the purposes and the forms. For example, if you have placement assessment, it's more on grouping and identification of needs or sectioning. So it could be on the assessment for learning, which is non-graded, or assessment as learning, but not on the assessment of learning. Formative assessment, it's for monitoring and feedbacking. It could be an assessment for learning and assessment as learning. For diagnostic, it's more on detection of problems to inform intervention. It could be in the assessment for learning or assessment as learning. For the summative assessment, which is used for certification and giving grades, it's more on assessment of learning and assessment as learning. Take note, the assessment for and assessment as are non-graded assessments, while assessment of learning are graded. So here are the things that you need to remember. When you say formative assessment, look for the terms feedback or monitoring of learners' performance. When you say placement assessment, it's more on learners' needs. It's more on putting them into groups or placing them in different sections. If you have diagnostic assessment, it's more on systematic errors, finding the systematic errors. For for teachers to do remedial instruction or the difficulties of the learners. That's diagnostic. Summative assessment. Its main purpose is to give a grade, to certify achievement, to report to parents and stakeholders what students learn, and maybe for scholarship purposes, to know who will be given scholarship grants. Self-assessment, it's more on the awareness of the student of what to know and do. And metacognition, it's more on thinking about thinking. It's going beyond thinking. And assessment for learning should have formative, placement, and diagnostic. And the main goal is for students to learn. Assessment of learning, it is summative in nature, and the main goal is to grade the students. Assessment as learning, you can have self-assessment and metacognition. The main goal is to reflect on one's learning. That's all, and thank you.